Two people are locked in an embrace, frozen at the exact moment Mount Vesuvius killed them. For over a century, museum placards, documentaries, and textbooks told you exactly who they were: a mother holding her daughter in her final seconds. It's one of the most reproduced, most emotional images to come out of ancient Rome. In 2024, a DNA study proved that story was never true. This is what happens when modern genetics gets to cross-examine one of archaeology's most famous assumptions, and it turns out the ash of Vesuvius preserved something the human imagination had been getting wrong for over 150 years. Let's start with how we even have these bodies to study in the first place, because the method itself is one of the strangest and most brilliant tricks in archaeological history. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it buried the city of Pompeii under volcanic ash and pumice. Over time, the soft tissue of the victims decomposed, leaving behind hollow voids in the hardened ash shaped exactly like the bodies that had once filled them, right down to the folds of clothing and the expressions frozen on their faces. For over 1,700 years, those voids just sat there underground, empty ghosts of people nobody could see. Then, in 1863, an Italian archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli had an idea that changed everything. When his team found one of these cavities, instead of just clearing it away, he poured liquid plaster directly into the void and let it set. Once it hardened, he excavated around it, and what emerged was a near-perfect three-dimensional cast of a human being at the exact moment of death, muscles tensed, clothing draped, in some cases, faces still showing something close to an expression. Fiorelli hadn't just found bodies, he'd found a way to resurrect a single frozen instant nearly 2,000 years after it happened. The casts kept giving up secrets long after Fiorelli's death. In 2015, a team led by researcher Stefano Vanacore ran CT scans on several of the plaster figures, something entirely impossible in the 19th century. Because Fiorelli's plaster had encased the actual skeletal remains inside it, the scans revealed real bones, real teeth, still sitting exactly where they'd been at the moment of death. The teeth, in particular, told an unexpected story. Many of the victims had remarkably good dental health, likely a result of a diet low in refined sugar and drinking water naturally rich in fluorine. A small detail, but it's a reminder that these casts aren't just haunting sculptures. They're sealed forensic evidence, waiting for whatever new technology eventually catches up to them. Among the most famous casts to come out of Fiorelli's original technique is a pair of figures found embracing each other, close together, in what looks unmistakably like a final act of comfort in the middle of catastrophe. For generations, this pair was described in museum exhibits and popular retellings alike as a mother and her daughter. Some versions of the story called them two sisters. Either way, the assumption was the same: a family bond, almost certainly female, holding on to each other as the city died around them. It's a beautiful story. It's also, according to a 2024 genetic study, wrong on more than one level. Here's the question that should be sitting in your mind right now. If nobody could see beneath the ash, how did anyone decide these were mother and daughter in the first place? The honest answer is that they didn't know. They assumed. The pose looked maternal to eyes trained on a particular idea of what tenderness between two people should look like. Nobody ran a genetic test in 1863 or for more than a century afterward. The story simply felt true, so it got repeated. Museum label after museum label, documentary after documentary, until it calcified into something that sounded like established fact. In 2024, an international team of researchers, including geneticists from Harvard Medical School working alongside Italian researchers, published a study in the journal Current Biology. They had extracted and analyzed ancient DNA from skeletal fragments preserved inside several of Pompeii's most famous plaster casts, using small existing gaps in the plaster to sample bone without damaging these irreplaceable artifacts. The results were not what a century and a half of assumption had prepared anyone for. The embracing pair, the so-called mother and daughter, were revealed by their DNA to both be male. and they weren't closely related at all. Let that resettle for a second. Not a mother and daughter, not sisters, two men, biologically unrelated, holding on to each other as the ash came down. And it wasn't an isolated correction. Another famous group of casts, found together in a house now known as the House of the Golden Bracelet, had long been interpreted as a family unit, a mother wearing an elegant gold bracelet shielding a child in her arms during their final moments. The genetic analysis found that the adult wearing that bracelet was, again, male. And the individuals in that group weren't a biological family either. So why did 19th and 20th century observers keep landing on the same kind of story? Mother and child, sisters embracing, family bonds expressed through physical closeness, because that was the framework available to the people doing the interpretation. A protective pose around a smaller figure read instantly as maternal to observers who had one dominant cultural template for what tenderness between two bodies was supposed to mean. Nobody was lying. They were pattern matching with the only pattern they had, and the ash never corrected them because it couldn't speak for itself. It just held the pose. This matters beyond Pompeii specifically. Roman society at the time of the eruption was startlingly cosmopolitan, built on networks of trade, migration, and slavery that moved people across the Mediterranean constantly. The same 2024 study found that the genetic ancestry of Pompeii's victims traced heavily to the Eastern Mediterranean, not a neat, homogeneous local population frozen in place, but a mixed, mobile, interconnected group of people whose relationships to each other didn't necessarily map onto the tidy nuclear family narratives that made for a better museum plaque 150 years later. Here's the uncomfortable, genuinely humbling part of this story. The plaster casts themselves never lied. They preserved exactly what they preserved. Two people in physical contact at the moment the world ended around them. Every assumption piled on top of that fact, the gender, the family relationship, the emotional narrative, came from us, not from the ash. We had the technology to freeze a moment in time 160 years before we had the technology to actually read who those people were. And in that gap, we filled in the blanks with the story that felt most familiar, not the one that happened to be true. The ash didn't need us to explain it. It was doing just fine holding two people exactly where they fell, for as long as it took someone to finally ask the right question, instead of assuming they already knew the answer.